At dawn, I was standing at my fence with a mug of coffee, watching an excavator cut into a drainage corridor I had measured back in 1987. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the diesel, not the backup alarm, the bucket. It dropped into the low run below the slope, bit into the bank, and folded wet soil over like it was dead dirt. Same bend, same channel, same shallow line I had marked by hand when the county still trusted pencils more than software. In the cadastral record, it sits under file number 1987-DR-044, Seasonal Watercourse. Not a nickname, not a local story, not one of those words people use when they want mud to sound official. A documented watercourse, and I had already warned him. By the time I was standing there at first light, with steam coming off the coffee and that machine pushing fill into a channel that had carried runoff longer than Brandon Marsh had been alive, I had already sent the first letter 8 months earlier. Certified mail, 1 page, no threat, no performance, just fact. Watercourse, state statute, buffer zone, recommendation to get a status determination from the county engineer before any grading started. The green receipt card stayed on my refrigerator under a magnet shaped like Lake Superior. I left it there because some things deserve to stay visible. Brandon never answered. His lawyer did. He used the phrase legally inactive. I remember that exactly because I read it twice. Legally inactive. That was a cute way to describe a drainage corridor that still moved water after every hard rain. I read the letter once at the kitchen table. Then I read it again standing up. Then I called the county drainage office. I didn't call because I was surprised. I called because I wanted to know how stupid his lawyer was willing to be in writing. That slope had been part of my working life for 30 years. I'm not saying that to sound sentimental. I'm saying it because I knew the ground. I knew the grade from the road to the lower ditch line. I knew where the clay shelves began. I knew where the topsoil thinned out. I knew what happened after a light rain, after a 2-inch rain, after 3 days of spring melt, and after those summer storms that dropped enough water to turn a quiet hill into somebody else's insurance claim. I knew that corridor before Brandon's father bought the parcel. I knew it when it was scrub, rough grass, cheap deer stands, and survey ribbons tied to young trees. I knew it when the county had to make drainage decisions nobody thanked us for until their basement stayed dry. That was the job. I spent a lot of years listening to people describe water like it had intentions. They'd say the hill wanted to dump on them. They'd say the ditch chose their lot. They'd say the storm came out of nowhere, like weather had singled them out for theater. Usually the answer was smaller and dumber. Somebody filled a swale. Somebody cheaped out on drain tile. Somebody moved runoff because they liked a cleaner lawn. Somebody signed off on work they didn't understand, then started acting offended when the ground kept behaving like ground. You learn that early in county work. The first voice on the phone is almost never the voice that caused the problem. It's the woman with wet boxes in the basement. It's the man standing in ankle-deep water by a furnace. It's the neighbor downhill who didn't make a single decision and still gets handed the bill. That's why I never had much patience for developers who talk about inconvenience like it only belongs to them. People only notice hydrology when it fails. If the corridor keeps working, nobody says a word. If some fool buries it under fill and concrete, 3 families downhill start making calls and blaming weather for what was really paperwork and ego. That was the stake. Not my fence. Not my view. Not my peace and quiet. 3 properties below that slope depended on that same drainage run whether they knew it or not. One had a walkout basement. One had an old detached garage sitting low on a slab poured in the late 70s. One had a septic field already closer to trouble than I liked. If you flatten that corridor and force the runoff sideways, you don't create a disagreement. You create standing water, foundation pressure, runoff trespass, and repeat flooding. That isn't an opinion, that's hydrology. Brandon Marsh didn't know any of that. He didn't have to. He inherited confidence instead. His father bought the parcel 20 years earlier as an investment hold. Partial permits got pulled over time. Some site approvals, some conditional work. Enough paper to make an unserious man feel protected. Then the father died, the son took title, and the parcel ended up in the hands of somebody who had never read a drainage file in his life. He had a law firm on annual retainer. I remembered his father, or at least the type of man his father was. Not a genius, not a villain, just cautious enough to know when paper meant more than confidence. Years earlier, I'd seen one of his permit packets during a routine review. Thin file, preliminary work, notes about grading sensitivity, a box checked for drainage consideration farther downslope. Nothing dramatic, but enough to tell me the father understood there was a reason the parcel had sat half awake for so long. He hadn't solved it, he just hadn't lied to himself about it. That was the difference between the two of them. The father treated the hill like a problem that came first. The son treated it like an accessory that came with the deed. A lot of men confuse that with competence. Brandon wasn't local. That showed in little ways. He dressed for the hill like it was a golf resort. He talked in that relaxed voice some men use when they think money has already solved the land. Clean truck, new boots, expensive sunglasses. He liked being seen on the parcel. He looked like a man marketing confidence to himself. The first time I saw him in person was 6 months before the excavator showed up. He was standing near the upper boundary with 2 men from a surveying company, 1 foot on a rock, pointing down the slope like he was already looking at terraces. He never looked at the corridor. That told me enough. Men who understand land look downhill first. Men who inherit paper look outward. The first letter I sent him was professional courtesy. That's the cleanest way to say it. I didn't know him. I didn't owe him more than the facts. I gave him more than he deserved anyway. I told him the low run on the parcel had long-standing characteristics of a seasonal watercourse under state riparian buffer law. I told him county status needed to be determined before any grading, trenching, culbing, fill placement, or foundation work. I attached the relevant statute section. I gave him the engineer's office number. I kept the tone neutral because neutral language ages well. People think a warning only counts if it sounds angry. That's wrong. Anger is easy to dismiss. Documentation is harder. The lawyer's response came 12 days later. 4 paragraphs. No citation to the state riparian statute. Not one. Instead, he leaned on a 2004 county cadastral map that labeled the low-run intermittent drainage. That was the whole trick. Intermittent drainage, therefore not formally certified. Therefore, in his phrasing, legally inactive. Technically clever, practically worthless. That 2004 map was produced after a drought year. I knew that because I was still working the district when it was compiled, and I remembered the complaints from landowners who thought a dry season had changed the watershed itself. It hadn't. Water doesn't disappear because a man in an office updates a layer on a county map. The state statute didn't care whether the county had already certified the corridor. Certification formalizes the status. It doesn't create the watercourse. The law applies to the feature itself. If the corridor meets the standard, the buffer is there whether the owner respects it or not. That was the hole in their position. Big enough to drive a tracked excavator into, apparently. I keep my files in a flat oak drawer in my office. No piles, no paper mess, no fake genius disorder. I've never trusted men who perform chaos around documents. Usually, it means they either don't know what matters, or they want an excuse for losing it. My file on that corridor had existed for more than 20 years before Brandon Marsh signed his first lender packet. 4 folders: flow records, photographs, correspondence, historical maps. That was it. The old flow records were still there from 1987, 1989, 1994, and 2003. Dates, weather references, measured depth, observed movement, soil response, bank condition. Enough to bore a normal person to death. Enough to matter when that normal person starts pouring concrete in the wrong place. The photographs were clean too. Stamped dates, seasonal tags, bank condition before and after heavy rain, runoff path after spring melt. One series from 2003 showed standing movement across the exact line Brandon's contractor would later flatten with fill. I didn't build that file because of Brandon. That was his problem. Men like that assume records begin when they arrive. They don't understand that some of us have already been watching long enough to make their confidence look rented. 3 weeks after grading started, I sent the second letter. Also certified. Also 1 envelope. This time, I attached more. Relevant section of the State Riparian Statute. Copy of a county precedent from Ramsey in 2011 involving a seasonal drainage feature and unlawful encroachment into the required buffer. Color photographs from the last major rain event showing active surface flow through the corridor. Date stamp, time stamp, location stamp. I didn't editorialize. I didn't threaten enforcement. I wrote one sentence that mattered. Before further earthwork proceeds, you are advised to obtain a formal status determination from the county engineer, as existing evidence strongly indicates the presence of a protected seasonal watercourse subject to setback restrictions under state law. That was a warning, a real one. Still polite, still professional, still more courtesy than the situation deserved. No answer came back. Not from Brandon, not from the lawyer. That's when the insult sharpened. Being disagreed with is normal. Being ignored after documented notice is something else. Once a man stops arguing and just keeps building, he is no longer claiming he's right. He's betting you'll stop. I didn't stop. I started dating everything more carefully. That became the rhythm of the next few months. I'd see activity on the hill, make a note, and add it to the file. Silt fence delivery, temporary stakes, a compact track loader near the upper shelf, a crew cutting access, fill spread across the low run. Nothing dramatic. That's how most bad decisions look at first. Modest, efficient, almost boring. Then, one morning a private surveyor showed up. I knew he was private before I saw the logo on the truck. County surveyors move differently. They look at land like people who might be blamed later. Private surveyors hired by developers look like men trying not to interfere with momentum. There were 3 of them. One on the upper line with a rod, one near the corridor driving flags, one at the tailgate with a tablet. I watched them from inside my truck parked off the shoulder. I didn't get out. No reason to. I had no interest in giving Brandon a scene he could use later. An old retired county man wandering over to argue with a private crew would have been useful to him, maybe even funny. So I stayed where I was. I took 6 photographs through the windshield, then 4 more from the shoulder after stepping out just long enough to frame the flag line. They marked the whole parcel, including the drainage corridor, as buildable dry drainage. That phrase reached me later through a copy of the survey notes pulled from a filing packet. Dry drainage. A phrase built to calm investors and insult gravity at the same time. By then, the slope looked wrong even in dry weather. If you spend enough years around land, you stop needing rain to tell you what's been violated. The corridor had a look. Compacted where it should have breathed. Smoothed where it should have broken. The banks were losing shape. The low run had been made shallow, wide, and obedient, which is how people redesign trouble when they think trouble needs to look clean before it can be sold. I drove past twice a week, sometimes more, never slowly enough to count as surveillance, never fast enough to miss anything important. Brandon started showing up more often himself, always clean, always with somebody. A contractor one day, a lender rep another, then 2 men in sport coats while he stood on the upper rise pointing downhill with both hands. He was selling the hill before the hill had agreed to behave. He still never looked down into the corridor. That almost became funny. Not funny enough to enjoy, just enough to notice. Around that time, I called the county drainage office again, not to complain, to confirm process. I already knew the answer. I just wanted to hear whether anything had shifted since my years inside the system. It hadn't. If the county had enough evidence to justify field review, the engineer could inspect, measure, compare historical indicators, and issue a formal status determination. If the feature qualified, the state buffer applied. Then anything built inside the setback became somebody's expensive problem. The clerk routed me to a younger engineer I didn't know. Good voice, careful, no swagger. Those are the ones I trust. He told me what I would have told a caller years earlier. Bring documentation. Dates matter. Historical records help. Visible encroachment matters. Surface flow after rain matters more. I thanked him and hung up. Then I made a separate folder for current evidence. That's what people misunderstand about patience. They think patience means waiting. Usually, it means organizing. The first strong rain after the second letter came on a Thursday afternoon. One of those ugly spring systems that turns the whole county into wet concrete and moving dirt. I put on my boots, took my phone, and walked the fence line. I filmed 3 clips. At the upper bend, runoff entered the corridor. At mid-slope, the regraded section started to sag under sheet flow. At the lower crossing, water found the old path anyway and moved under the fresh fill like it had never signed the redesign. That was the important one. You could see the flow searching for the corridor through the dirt Brandon had paid to flatten. Not guesswork, not standing puddles, directional movement, persistence. I recorded the date, time, rainfall total, and approximate duration. Then I backed the files up that same night. That became video 1 in the new sequence. Video 3 was after a lighter rain. Not dramatic enough for anybody looking for disaster, but useful for the opposite reason. You could see the water take the corridor even when the storm wasn't impressive. That matters. A feature that only wakes up during catastrophe is easier for a bad lawyer to talk around. A feature that keeps showing itself under ordinary weather starts sounding less like interpretation and more like record. Video 8 was the ugly one. Brown water, fast surface movement, fresh silt curling under the graded section where the first slab had already changed how the soil was taking pressure. I watched that one twice before I archived it because it had the quality I always look for in evidence. It explained itself. Video 11 was almost quiet. A gray morning after steady overnight rain. No storm drama, no roaring runoff, just water moving where the corridor had always moved, ignoring Brandon's revisions like they were temporary furniture. That was the sequence I wanted. Not one big event people could call unusual, a pattern. Patterns are what institutions trust when they finally decide to wake up. By the time 8 months had passed, I had 12. Not because I was obsessive, because rain keeps appointments even when men don't. The social wound in all this was simple. Nobody said it out loud, but it was there in every response and every non-response. Retired man next door, old county file, outdated knowledge, manageable nuisance. That was the category Brandon put me in without ever meeting me. His lawyer did the same thing, just with better grammar. They treated record as opinion. They treated warning as posture. They treated the land like a stage set built for a brochure. That kind of contempt doesn't need raised voices. It shows up in what people feel safe ignoring. I never wrote them emotionally. That would have reduced the value of the letters. But privately, I understood what kind of person I was dealing with. Brandon wasn't reckless in the dramatic sense. He was worse. He was professionally reassured. He had bought enough language to feel safe from dirt. There are few men easier to damage than that. Not because they're evil, because they start believing procedure belongs to them. Weeks passed, then months. The grading became framing prep. The framing prep became utility layout. Truck traffic increased. Material stacks appeared near the upper shelf. The private surveyor came back once. A concrete subcontractor came twice. One afternoon, I saw Brandon on site with what looked like a lender's field inspector. Hard hat, clipboard, clean khakis trying very hard not to touch real dirt. I stayed in my truck, watched for 4 minutes, wrote down the plate. Not because the plate mattered. The date did. Everything in a case like that turns on sequence. Who knew what and when? Who was warned before money moved? Who ignored the warning after receipt? Who kept going after visible encroachment? That's where confidence turns into evidence. When the first slab was poured, I already had the measurement in mind before I confirmed it. I went out the next morning with an old rangefinder, a field notebook, and the county line copy I had marked the night before. Then I checked it again later against the scaled survey sheet once I got access to it through the filing trail. 41 feet from the central axis of the corridor. 41. The required riparian buffer under the state rule was 75. That meant the slab wasn't close. It was deep inside. Not an edge mistake. Not a contractor wandering 2 feet offline. Not a staking error somebody could explain away with a tired sigh and a corrected footing. Deep inside. The kind of wrong that doesn't leave room for graceful language. I remember standing in my office after that measurement and setting the coffee down without drinking it. The file drawer was already open. The first 4 folders were where they always were. I added the measurement note to the current evidence file. Then I took out a fresh sheet of paper. I listed dates. I listed deliveries. I listed visible grading phases. I listed documented rainfall events showing active flow through the corridor after disturbance. I listed the survey language I had obtained. I listed the slab placement as measured against the center line. I cited the statute again. This time, I also prepared a copy for the county drainage office. Not a complaint. Not yet. An informational notice. That phrase mattered. It's the kind of phrase people ignore when they think paperwork is harmless. I typed Brandon Marsh's name once at the top, then the parcel number, then the file number for the watercourse, 1987-DR-044. Same as it had been when I first measured it. Same as it was when his father bought the hill. Same as it was while Brandon stood on top of it with clean boots and borrowed certainty. The room was quiet when I finished. Office lamp, open folder, wall clock ticking the way my wife used to complain about because it sounded louder at night. That's the thing about the first slab. People treat it like proof a project is real. Sometimes it proves something else. Sometimes it's the point where a bad decision gets expensive enough to deserve a name. I signed the third letter, folded it once, set it beside the envelope. 5 days later, the green cards came back. Brandon signed for his own copy that time. That mattered because once a man signs for a measurement, he owns the measurement whether he reads it or not. The lawyer answered first, not with a rebuttal, with a threat. Cease and desist. Intentional interference with lawful use of private property. False representations. Damages if my conduct caused delay, lender concern, reputational injury, or investor hesitation. That last part told me more than the rest. Investor hesitation. Most legal threats revealed a fear they were hired to hide. The letter was 3 pages long and polished within an inch of its life. Lots of strong verbs, lots of decorative confidence. Still no clean answer to the state statute. Still no explanation for the slab inside the buffer if the corridor was as irrelevant as they kept pretending. I read it once. Then I set it on my desk beside the third letter I had sent. Mine looked like a measuring instrument. His looked like cologne. The cease and desist had that expensive tone certain firms love, too polished to sound local, too smooth to sound certain. A letter written for a client who needed to feel taller by the time he got to page 3. It accused me of interference, but what it really wanted was shame. The old trick: make the retired man feel exposed. Make him picture himself as the only person still standing in the way of progress. Make him wonder if maybe he had become the story people tell over dinner about a bitter neighbor with too much time. That kind of letter works on men who still need permission to trust their own records. I didn't. I put it in the folder. That was all. After that, the pressure widened. Not on me, around him. The project started trying to look bigger than the land under it. A local PR firm launched a page for the development. I found it the same way I find most stupid things now. Publicly, in daylight, without leaving my chair. Marsh Ridge Estate. That was the name. 8 private acres. Luxury residential enclave. Limited release. Site-responsive architecture. Integrated natural landscape feature. That last phrase was my favorite. That's how they described the drainage corridor Brandon had partially buried. Not a watercourse. Not a protected feature pending determination. Not a constraint. A feature. Something to admire from a terrace with a glass in your hand. The renderings were expensive. You can always tell. Perfect sky, thin railings, long windows, clean stone, fake evening light. The kind of fake life that only appears after a designer has removed every object that could prove a real person ever lived there. In the renderings, stairs stepped down toward the corridor like it was ornamental. The corridor wasn't just being built over, It was being sold. One rendering showed a stone terrace stepping down toward the corridor with 2 chairs placed at the edge, angled toward a view that didn't exist from that point, unless you were also willing to admire disturbed runoff and fill wash. Another showed warm light spilling from floor-to-ceiling windows onto a path that cut straight through ground no sane engineer would have marketed as leisure space. That's what made the whole thing so recognizable. It wasn't just development. It was second-generation confidence wearing presentation software. Take a real constraint, rename it an amenity, light it like a hotel brochure, and wait for men with money to mistake aesthetic for due diligence. That changed the file again. Once a man starts marketing the violation, he turns private stupidity into public evidence. I printed the page. Then the investor packet summary when it surfaced through a local deal notice. 7 private investors, about 11 million committed across debt, construction capital, and pre-release funding. I only needed 2 names. A hotel franchise owner from Stillwater, a surgical practice partner from Medina. The rest sat behind LLC names so generic they sounded machine-made. I didn't know any of them personally. Didn't need to. They were in the record. Brandon had also borrowed against the parcel itself. A recorded security instrument tells a story if you know how to read past the lender language. The family parcel sat as collateral under a builder finance package. There was a personal guarantee attached to Brandon's name. Plain English, it worked like this. If the project moved cleanly, the guarantee stayed boring. If the project stalled before completion, the bank could stop treating the parcel like the only thing at risk and start reaching for Brandon himself. House, accounts, anything pledged or reachable under the agreement. That wasn't revenge, that was math. He had signed a structure built on momentum. Men like that always do. Brandon began showing up on site with a different posture after the PR page went up. Before, he looked like a man supervising work. After, he looked like a man already hosting memory. He started bringing people in polished shoes. I'd see 2 SUVs near the upper rise, then 4. Men in quarter zips. A woman in a cream coat once, standing on packed dirt with sunglasses on her head, while Brandon spread both hands toward the western view like he was offering geography for sale. He always worked the high ground. That made sense. The high ground was still expensive. The lower ground was where the facts lived. A second slab was formed. Utility trenching continued. A retaining wall crew came in for 2 days, then 3 more. Stone pallets showed up. PVC conduit showed up. A portable office trailer appeared near the drive. The site started developing that temporary look wealthy men love, where disorder feels like progress because every disorder costs money. Money creates its own anesthesia. That's one reason bad projects survive so long. Each new truck convinces somebody the last truck must have meant everything was fine. Then the rain came again. A hard one this time. Thick summer rain with enough weight in it to flatten weeds and find every lie in the ground. I walked the fence line with my phone inside a freezer bag and filmed from 3 points I had already marked in my head. At the upper bend, runoff entered the disturbed corridor faster than the fill could absorb it. At midslope, water cut a narrow line along the edge of the first slab form and disappeared under soil that had been compacted flat for appearance. At the lower section, it came through again where the old path wanted it to come through, carrying silt under the graded face. That clip was clear enough for a hearing board, clear enough for an engineer, clear enough for a child. Water is rude that way. It keeps demonstrating. That became video 7. The 12th was the one I knew would matter if anybody still needed convincing. The first slab had already been poured, and the flow still tracked through the same corridor line after a night storm, slipping under regraded soil like the project was a stage built over a drain. You didn't need technical training to understand it. You just needed eyes. The cease and desist letter told me something useful too. Not about the law, about the social order Brandon thought he lived inside. It was simple. Lawyers talk. Retired men quiet down. County people delay. Contractors proceed. Investors arrive. Brochure language replaces topography. Then somebody calls the whole thing vision. That was the system he trusted. To be fair, it works often enough to make people arrogant. Brandon's mistake was thinking the county engineer's office was part of the decorative layer. It wasn't. It was slow. That's different. Silence is usually just paperwork walking. Around then, I learned Brandon was planning a private investor lunch on the property. I didn't learn that through gossip. A catering truck rolled past my gate on a Thursday morning, followed by 2 rental vans and a company laying white tent flooring on packed dirt near the upper shelf. You don't need much imagination to identify a celebration when men start unloading linen tables onto an active construction site. The lunch itself wasn't the important part. The timing was. Because that same week, I finished the submission packet for the county. 94 pages. Flow records, historic maps, photographs from 1987 forward, rainfall logs, 12 videos indexed by date, copies of all 3 letters, certified receipts, the lawyer's responses, survey notes using the phrase dry drainage, printouts from Marsh Ridge Estate showing the corridor marketed as a natural amenity. I didn't bind it fancy. No bright tabs, no dramatic cover page, just a clean, technical packet in order of relevance with an index that respected the time of whoever had to read it. I drove it to the county office myself. The younger engineer met me in the lobby because I had called ahead. He was younger than my career. That was fine. He looked through the first section while standing there, not browsing, reading. That was enough for me. I asked him to initial each page received. He flipped through the index, paused at the rainfall log section, then at the stills from the later storm videos. He didn't say much, which I liked. Men who talk too early around a file usually want to show you they're thinking. Men who are actually thinking tend to get quieter as the packet gets worse. I had arranged the sections so the story tightened as it moved. Historic existence first, recent disturbance second, notice third, encroachment fourth, marketing language last. By the time a reader reached the renderings, the lie wasn't theoretical anymore. It had a date, a measurement, and a recipient's signature. He gave me the look people reserve for difficult old men who turn out to be right more often than they'd prefer. Then he did it. 94 pages. Initialed. Dated. Receipt noted. People think evidence is the document. Half the time, evidence is proof the document arrived before the excuse did. The field inspection happened on a rainy Tuesday. That was useful. The engineer came in a county vehicle just after 9. Dark jacket, field boots, clipboard case. No audience, no performance. He parked off the shoulder and walked the slope with the patience I like to see in public employees. He didn't rush to appear decisive. He didn't rush to appear neutral either. He just looked. I met him at the fence with copies of the older flow records and the map overlays. We didn't talk much. No need. I pointed out the historic centerline markers and the locations matching the dated photographs. He took his own measurements. He took soil samples from the lower bank. He photographed the disturbed section. He stood near the first slab for a while without saying anything. That's another thing people get wrong. Silence from competent people isn't passivity. Usually, it's the sound of somebody refusing to speak before the record is ready. He checked the grade, checked the lower discharge line, checked the disturbed bank composition. Then he thanked me, got back in the county vehicle, and left. No promise, no opinion, no hint. Just work. I went home, made coffee, and put the duplicate records back in the drawer. Then the real waiting started. Not nervous waiting, routine waiting. I mowed the grass. I cleaned the garage. I read 2 bad books and 1 decent one. I checked the mailbox each afternoon. On the hill, Brandon kept building. That was useful. He took the county's silence as clearance. The second slab was completed. Then the third was formed and poured. 2 retaining walls advanced below the upper grade. Utility runs continued toward the section that should never have been touched. He held showings from the road. He let the PR page keep breathing. He kept feeding the illusion because illusion had payroll now. You could feel the false safety hardening around him. His lawyer had threatened. The county had not yet moved. The bank had funded. The investors had been fed renderings and slope-side optimism. In Brandon's world, that meant the problem had passed. In mine, it meant the measuring phase was over. The letter arrived on a Monday. County envelope, standard stock, nothing dramatic about it. That's worth remembering. Real damage rarely arrives dressed for the occasion. I opened it at the kitchen table with the same letter opener I'd had for years. 8 pages, county engineer signature, date at the top. Formal determination that the corridor qualified as a protected natural seasonal watercourse under the state standard. That triggered the 75-foot riparian buffer in full. Automatic application. No decorative language, no moral language, just consequence. The notice also said a stop work order would issue to the landowner within 7 business days for all encroaching work inside the protected setback. That's the kind of sentence that changes a project without raising its voice. I read the 8 pages once, then again more slowly. Everything that needed to exist was there. Historic basis, field observations, soil and flow characteristics, disturbance context, protected status, buffer application, enforcement sequence. No gaps big enough for swagger. I put the letter in the folder. Then I called the engineer and thanked him. The call took less than 2 minutes. He said the order would move through standard procedure. I said I understood. Then I hung up and put the phone back on the counter. Outside, the hill looked the same. That was the nice part. No visible thunder, no cinematic collapse, no men shouting on the road. Just the same unfinished work sitting in the same wrong place under the same sky, with 7 business days left before the county said out loud what the land had already been saying for months. 7 business days isn't a dramatic amount of time. It's just enough time for a man to keep acting like the future still belongs to him. Brandon used 6 of them well. More trucks, more site traffic, more polished confidence moving up and down the drive. The PR page stayed live. The rendering stayed clean. The roadside showings continued. The retaining walls sat where they sat. The 3rd slab cured under open sky like concrete had already won some argument nobody else remembered hearing. That last week before service had a particular smell to it. Fresh cut lumber, wet soil, new concrete, catering prep, the smell of people spending borrowed money in public. Brandon moved around the site like a man already walking through his own article. He'd stop near the upper rise with a phone in his hand, smile at people getting out of black SUVs, then angle his body so the half-finished lower ground stayed behind him. He was good at that. Not building, framing. A man like that doesn't need the problem gone. He just needs it off to one side long enough for lunch. From my yard, the hill looked stable. That was the dangerous part. Bad projects usually look strongest right before paperwork reaches them. On the 7th day, the white tent went up. I saw the frame first from the side yard while I was rinsing out a coffee mug at the sink. Then the linen rental truck. Then the catering van. Then 2 black SUVs. Then 3 more. Then a sedan with dealer plates that had probably spent most of its life carrying somebody important to lunch. The tent was set on the upper section of the parcel, above the corridor, where the grade was still flattering and the dirt could still pass for intention instead of disturbance. White tablecloths, folding chairs with covers, glassware. You can dress a problem up if the slope is steep enough. I didn't go over. I didn't stand at the gate. I didn't try to hear speeches. I didn't lurk behind a fence waiting for applause. I stayed on my property. I could see the top of the tent from the yard and part of the access drive from the road. The rest I learned the same way most clean facts arrive in a county like ours. Public record, 2 neighbors with decent memories, and a service copy of the order itself. That was enough. You don't need front row seating when the document exists. The event was supposed to be the formal investor lunch for Phase 1 of Marsh Ridge Estate. That was the phrase in one of the promotional emails later attached to the file. Formal investor lunch, private presentation, launch sequence. The men who write those invitations always sound like they're introducing weather they personally arranged. Most of the investors were there. The Stillwater hotel man, navy jacket, no tie. One neighbor remembered him because he kept wiping dust off his loafers with a cocktail napkin before the food came out. The surgical practice partner from Edina was there too. Gray suit. Younger than I expected from the filings. He brought a woman with sunglasses on her head who spent half the lunch looking at the retaining wall like she didn't trust it. Brandon walked them the view line first. That tracked. He liked selling elevation. The corridor was downhill from the fantasy and uphill from the consequence. That makes it easy to ignore if you've got money in the project, but not much land in your blood. He gave a short talk under the tent. One neighbor said he used the phrase, legacy scale development. Another said he raised a glass and thanked the investors for trusting his vision. Maybe both. Men like Brandon usually give the same speech in layers. Then, the county vehicle came up the drive. No siren, no rush, no line of cars, just one county drainage vehicle pulling in while lunch was already on the tables. The inspector had a tablet and a paper service packet. That detail is clean because it appears in the service note. Served in person, landowner present, receipt refused. That last part didn't surprise me. Men who spend months ignoring documents often develop principles about not touching them. According to the neighbors, Brandon lowered his glass before the inspector reached the tent. One investor stood, one didn't. Somebody asked if this was a mistake. Somebody else asked if they should step aside. The inspector didn't make a speech. He served the order, identified the affected area, and explained what the paper already said. One document is enough when the measuring is done. I read the order later that afternoon from the service copy. The language was plain. All work within the 75-foot riparian buffer was to cease immediately. All structures, flatwork, retaining elements, and installed utilities within the protected setback were to remain untouched pending enforcement review and restoration requirements. Any permanent improvements placed within the buffer were subject to removal before restoration approval. Removal would be at the landowner's expense. A compliance lien would attach to the property until the county's requirements were satisfied. That's a strong order, not because it sounds theatrical, because every sentence closes a door. By the time Brandon finished reading it, the lunch no longer had a purpose. The white tablecloths were still there. The food was still there. The tent was still standing. But the project under it had changed species. Before the order, the build was a momentum story. After the order, it was a liability story. That shift happens fast. People feel it before they understand it. One neighbor said, "Nobody touched dessert." That part may not be exact, but I believe it. Sugar doesn't do much when a lien has just entered the conversation. The site went quiet the next morning. Not silent, quiet. A few subcontractors showed up, stood at the gate, made calls, and left. A flatbed came and turned around without unloading. By noon, there was county notice tape fixed at the access point and a laminated stop work posting in a weather sleeve tied to the temporary gate. Orange against unfinished wood. Very readable. The PR page stayed live for 2 more days, then went down, then came back with softer language. No more launch sequence, no more integrated natural landscape feature. The copy changed to future site enhancement pending administrative review. Still dishonest, just less ambitious. Brandon's lawyer filed the appeal almost immediately. County Administrative Board, standard route. He called the order erroneous, premature, and based on incomplete field interpretation. Brandon made a public statement too, brief enough to sound advised. He said the county had made a mistake and the matter would be corrected through the proper process. That was the line. Men only discover respect for process after process starts biting them. The halt held. That was the important part. The appeal didn't restart work. The slabs stayed where they were. The retaining walls stayed where they were. The conduit stayed in the ground. The project stopped earning its own excuses. I attended the hearing 30 days later, not as a witness, not as a party, just as an observer in the back row. I had done my part already. The file was in the county's hands. The engineer's determination existed. My presence didn't need to become part of the story. The room was smaller than people imagine when they hear the word board. Bad fluorescent light. Cheap chairs. 2 flags nobody looked at. A long table for county staff, and a shorter one where Brandon and his lawyer sat with the private surveyor who had labeled the corridor dry drainage. Brandon wore a dark suit and the expression of a man trying to look insulted without looking worried. It takes effort to split those in half. The surveyor went first. Same basic argument. Intermittent feature, prior map classification, limited significance. Seasonal movement insufficient, in his opinion, to justify the protected designation as applied. He spoke carefully. I'll give him that. But careful isn't the same as useful. His method was thin. Late season observation, map reliance, no long-range record, no historical measurement series, no real weight given to repeated post-rainflow evidence. He had inspected a moving system like it was a parking lot. The county engineer answered in the plain voice I prefer. No flourish, no offense taken. He summarized the field inspection, the soil characteristics, the bank form, the discharge path, the disturbance pattern, and the historical evidence set. Then the 12 videos. Then the older flow records. Then the dated photographs. Then the 3 letters and certified receipts establishing prior notice before continued encroachment. That sequence mattered. Not just that the watercourse existed, that Brandon had been warned before he kept building. The board members watched the clips. Nobody needed help understanding them. Water entered, tracked, persisted, and reappeared through the same corridor Brandon had graded, sold, and partially covered. At one point, Brandon's lawyer said the county was overreaching based on an informal record assembled by an interested neighboring retiree. That was me, obviously. I wrote the phrase down in my notebook because it was almost elegant in its stupidity. Interested neighboring retiree. The board chairman looked at the engineer and asked one question. Did the determination rely solely on my file? The engineer said no. He said the historical materials were useful, the prior notice was relevant, and the videos were persuasive, but the county's determination rested on its own field inspection, soil findings, topographic behavior, statutory criteria, and documented encroachment measurements. That ended the little side game. I liked that answer. It put me where I belonged, not as the law, not as the hero, just as a man who handed competent people the right record before they had to do their job. The board recessed. 22 minutes. I know because I checked the wall clock twice and wrote the start and return times on the inside flap of my notebook. When they came back, the chairman read the result in a voice flat enough to survive translation into a parking receipt. Appeal denied. Engineer's determination upheld. Stop work order remains in effect. Encroachments subject to enforcement and restoration compliance. No questions from the board after that. No lecture, no moral. Nothing Brandon could argue with except reality, and the county had already entered that into the file. He stayed seated for a second after the ruling. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, said something to the lawyer, and left through the side door instead of the main aisle. I didn't follow. I waited for the room to clear, then walked to my truck, drove home, and made coffee. The site remained idle. That's where the financial part started doing its work. Builder finance packages are built on time, draw sequence, inspection continuity, and the assumption that concrete leads somewhere. If the project freezes long enough, the paper turns on the borrower. 90 days after the stop work order, the bank issued its default notice. That document mattered even more than the hearing result from Brandon's point of view, though he probably understood it later than he should have. The default was tied to stalled progress toward completion under the loan terms. Once that condition held, the personal guarantee attached to Brandon stopped being decorative. Before default, the parcel carried the project. After default, Brandon did. The bank could stop pretending the land alone would solve the problem. That wasn't personal in the emotional sense, it was personal in the contractual sense. A colder thing. Investor movement started after that. Not all at once. People always imagine exits as one dramatic stampede. Usually, they're quieter. The Stillwater Hotel man was first in a way I could track cleanly. His entity withdrew from a $1.2 million participation position less than 2 weeks after the default notice. The surgical practice partner followed later through an assignment exit tied to roughly $900,000 in phased exposure. Same conclusion, he no longer wanted to be in Brandon's future. 2 other investor entities stopped appearing in the amended materials at all. The family office money got quiet. That usually means the adults have entered the room. Brandon tried to keep control of the narrative. Predictable. He explored legal options. He talked about state court review. He floated delay strategies. He let people around him say the county had overreached. He kept acting like time itself might get embarrassed and reverse. But time was working for the order now. The order didn't need to hurry. The property went up for sale before winter ended. The broker tried to do what brokers do: tight angles, sunset aerials, language about rarity, upside, premier positioning, long view value. There are only so many ways to photograph a mistake from above. Every version still had the same problem buried inside the disclosure packet. Every serious buyer with a real attorney would hit the same paragraph, make the same face, and move on. The listing wasn't a sale attempt. Not really. It was Brandon trying to locate a stranger willing to inherit his denial at a discount. $14 million at first. The listing photographs did what they could. Wide aerials, soft light, tight framing, lots of view, not much ground truth. The unfinished slabs were called foundational progress. The retaining walls were called premium structural investment. The stop work order appeared in the disclosures as an active administrative condition. That's a fine phrase too. Sounds like a cough. What it meant was simpler. Any buyer stepping in would inherit the same problem. 3 slabs inside the buffer, 2 retaining walls, installed utilities in restricted ground, a restoration burden, a county lien until compliance. No sane buyer pays luxury pricing for inherited demolition. 6 weeks later, the asking price dropped to $8 million. No movement. There was never going to be movement. You can't sell your way out of a measurement once the measurement has been adopted by government and attached to the title. The county's demolition estimate came in after that. A consulting engineer prepared it for enforcement planning. Roughly $800,000 to remove the 3 slabs, the 2 retaining walls, the installed utility segments within the protected setback, haul debris, stabilize disturbed ground, re-establish the corridor, and complete the required restoration work under supervision. That was before inspection fees, before legal cost, before carrying cost on idle debt, before whatever Brandon had already burned paying people to tell him he still had options. $800,000 is a clean number on paper. In real life, it feels heavier, especially when the thing being removed was once called Phase 1. The parcel now sits the way failed confidence usually sits. Fenced, partially finished, too expensive to ignore, too contaminated by consequence to continue. The orange stop work posting is weathered now. The plastic sleeve has gone cloudy at the corners. The access road has weeds pushing through its edge line. After rain, the corridor still takes water under the 3rd slab, because concrete doesn't settle arguments with grade. It only delays them. The bank filed suit. Open case, no mystery there. Family assets tied to the guarantee went under pressure after that. Not all seized at once. Not some movie version where men in suits empty the house before breakfast. Just the slow, ugly compression of a contract finally deciding to mean what it said. That is usually worse. Fast disaster lets people pretend they were ambushed. Slow disaster forces them to read. As for me, I'm where I was all along. At my desk, on the property, in the same house. The file drawer still clean. The corridor file still in order. I logged the 2024 flow data this spring and added the new readings to the old sequence. The discharge was slightly higher than the year before. Wet season ran longer. The lower bank held better once the last heavy rain cut around the disturbed edge and found the old path again. This spring, I measured after a slower thaw, the kind that doesn't impress anybody until you realize it has been feeding the same ground for days. The corridor held its shape better than I expected along the lower bank. The disturbed section above it still looked wrong. You can see that from the color alone. Native pattern below, human impatience above. I wrote the new numbers in the same sequence as the old ones. 1987, 1989, 1994, 2003. Then the recent years. That is another thing people misunderstand. A file like that is not memory. It is continuity. That is why it outlives confidence so easily. I still walk the fence line after storms. Not because I'm guarding anything heroic, because measurement is a habit once it has paid for itself often enough. People ask sometimes, in that careful way people ask when they want a lesson to exist, whether I feel satisfied. I tell them the clean version first. The corridor qualified, or it didn't. The statute applied, or it didn't. The measurements were right, or they weren't. Everything else came afterward. The true version is only a little less polite. I warned him 3 times. The law did not change between the first letter and the third. What changed was how much he managed to